We asked you what sector you were joining us from, and from the international development sector, about a fifth, 22%. Farming, only 6%. We'd love to see more farmers tuning in today. The agri-food industry, 15% of you watching are from there. The biggest number are joining us from the university research sector, and also around another fifth, 19%, from civil society and independent. I'm going to give you another Slido question now, which will feed into our first panel discussion in a bit. Ireland has an historical experience of famine, which Susanna was talking about there. So what types of game-changing solutions should Ireland therefore be focusing on at the Food Systems Summit? Is it empowerment and innovation for smallholder farmers, universal social protection, the elimination of hunger, improved low-carbon agri-food infrastructure, or conflict prevention and peace building? Let us know which one of those you think is most important. And now please welcome our next keynote speaker. As you've heard, he's Dr. Jamie Morrison, the Director of Food Systems and Food Safety Division at the Food and Agriculture Organisation. And Jamie is also a member of the Food Systems Summit Secretariat. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Anya, and good afternoon to all. Let me begin by elaborating on a couple of points that Susanna Moorhead made on the importance of food system transformation in accelerating progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. While some of the initial concerns about the potential disruptions to food availability as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic were alleviated through the maintenance of trade flows and food systems functionality, the pandemic continues to bring into sharp focus the many areas in which food systems are not delivering on desired social outcomes. One of the starkest of the many challenges that we face is that even before the pandemic, 690 million people were suffering from hunger, a number that had already been increasing over the past few years and which has jumped sharply in the past 12 months. And this puts us even further behind our target of eliminating hunger by 2030. Of course, the drivers and patterns of inadequate food and nutrition security are complex, and they manifest in very different ways. The challenge of eliminating hunger often sits alongside the growing health concerns associated with increasing prevalence of overweight and obesity, and the reduced potential of the many millions more suffering the consequences of micronutrient deficiencies. But one of the many underlying factors that are constraining our ability to reverse these trends is the fact that 3 billion people are unable to afford a healthy diet, and this is particularly concerning. With the impacts of COVID continuing to reduce the impacts of the most vulnerable, affordability will increasingly constrain food choices, and by implication, this will hold back the required transformations of food systems. So how do we address the complex problems of ensuring that food systems deliver safe, nutritious, and affordable food to all, but do so in a way that also drives greater equity in livelihoods and purchasing power and makes a positive contribution to the natural resource environment? And this is where the Food Systems Summit is so important. Through the national dialogues such as this one, which are now taking place in over 100 countries globally, the summit is providing a process whereby nations can identify pathways to more sustainable food systems that are relevant to their particular challenges and capacities. Informed by the work of 5 summit action tracks, these dialogues will allow countries to develop and to commit to bold actions that they and their development partners will need to take if these pathways are to be successfully implemented. But of course, this involves working through many complex trade-offs and paradoxes. For example, how do we encourage changes in consumer behavior which are needed to drive improvements in health outcomes and in the way in which food is produced, when such a large proportion of the global population is so heavily constrained in the choices that they can afford to make? Here, enhanced social protection programs will surely need to play a critical role. Equally, how do we square the importance of ensuring that mechanisms are in place to limit disruptions to global food trade in times of crisis, with the need to develop resilient local food systems that address issues of poor returns to producers and inadequate or unsafe diets, but which at the same time may imply restrictions on cheap food imports. Many of these challenges are not new, and some countries have been navigating them successfully for decades. There is much to learn from these cases and to share with others as they develop their pathways to improve food systems. Ireland's journey has provided to be an invaluable source of inspiration for FAO's work on food systems. In early 2018, we joined colleagues from the African Union Commission and representatives from 11 countries across Africa to engage in a series of conversations with a range of public and private sector leaders in Dublin. Our African colleagues observed a unique coherence in approach and in vision, and that inspired ideas that they could then take back to their own countries. In fact, the learning exchange was so well received that the African Union Commission subsequently invited Irish representatives from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, Sustainable Food Systems Ireland, Bord Bia, Glanbia, the Smurfit Business School, and Irish Aid to travel to the African continent to continue this lesson sharing with events that were held in Rwanda and Uganda in 2019. At the same time, we've been working in collaboration with Wageningen University to document such lessons so that this experience can be shared more widely and used as a source of inspiration for other countries. To list a few of these lessons: Ireland's success in linking science, research, extension, and education and placing it at the core of systems transformation. Ireland's integrated approach has accelerated knowledge absorption while also ensuring a continuous flow of high quality expertise to the food industry. The integrated approach has also strengthened linkages between education institutes, industry, and farmers. The benefits of the public-private Origin Green training partnerships are illustrative of this. And at FAO, we've been very fortunate to be the recipients of 2 Origin Green placements, Cleaner Conlon and Shabale Bird, over the past few years. The long-standing priority that Ireland has placed on food safety and authenticity assurances has also been a critical transformational factor. The fact that the sector has been able to leverage its traceability mechanisms for tracking sustainability targets is commendable, and again, an important lesson that can be replicated in other countries. There are many other learnings that I could refer to, but I would like to end this presentation by simply reiterating the invaluable source of inspiration that Ireland's journey continues to provide to many of us. We will continue to watch and to learn as Ireland navigates its way as a world leader in the production of sustainably produced, affordable and nutritious food, both through its domestic consumers, but importantly for the global community. Thank you very much.
And Jamie, our thanks to you. And let me go straight ahead and introduce our first panel to you. Tom Arnold, former head of concern and currently amongst the many hats that Tom wears. Tom chairs Ireland's 2030 Agri-Food Food Strategy Committee. Michelle Winthrop joins us from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where she's Policy Director in the Development, Cooperation and Africa Division. Owen Devenish is the chairman of the Belfast-based Devenish Group, which exports to more than 50 countries. And Professor Charlie Spillane joins us remotely. He chairs the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development. And now let's show our panel what you thought in answer to our second Slido poll. And this was based on our historical experience of famine. What kinds of game-changing solutions Ireland should be focusing on at the Food Systems Summit. And pretty much the big majority, 42%, spoke about empowerment and innovation for smallholder farmers. Universal social protection, only 7% said that was the most important, 10% saying the elimination of hunger the most important. Our runner-up, if you like, improved low-carbon agri-food infrastructure, and that was 36%, and only 4% selecting conflict prevention and peacemaking. And Tom Arnold, it's really interesting there, isn't it, that our viewers joining us today, they think that empowerment and innovation for small smallholder farmers and also working on low-carbon agri-food infrastructure. So, given what we've heard in all the dialogue so far and what we're trying to do now in, if you like, lining up our trade policy and our development policy, so they're all basically singing off the same hymn sheet, would you agree with those as priorities for us going into the summit in the autumn?
Well, yes. I mean, they reflect a range of opinion. I mean, I think what it really says is that there's an acceptance now that working towards sustainable food systems is indeed the correct policy priority. I think it's very important, though, to say that hunger, which has been at the elimination of hunger, which has been at the centre of Irish policy over a long period of time, it remains of critical importance.
Does it concern you that that's 10%? Is there a sense, because I was struck by what Jamie was saying, about even before the pandemic, nearly 700 million people were suffering from hunger, 3 billion can't afford a healthy diet. You know, and we know that all of that has gotten worse since the pandemic, and we're off the 2030 targets. Yeah. Is there a sense in which we're still not grasping how difficult a problem this is?
I think I would prefer to see that 10% figure higher, because I think it's fundamental to achieving. I mean, even if you're going for promoting sustainable food systems, making sure that the people at the bottom of the pile, if you like, can meet their needs is crucially important. But I think the real point, and it's Jamie and Susanna reflected on it, is that this year is a crucially important moment to look at the whole issue of food and its sustainability. It's important to acknowledge that this year a food system summit will take place, but that's only the 6th such summit in the last 80 years. People probably don't realise how seldom something like this happens.
And it's probably never happened at a more critical time.
It's recognising that food is in a more complex area than ever before. I mean, in the past, World Food Summits were really devoted to looking at what to do about people who risk being hungry. This now recognises that food is a more complex area. Food has to not only produce food, the sector has to produce food for people to eat, but it also has to do it in a sustainable way so that we can achieve our climate and environmental goals. And it also has to acknowledge the fact that food is directly related to health. In the last 20 years in particular, we've moved to what is, if you like, an epidemic of overweight and obesity at the global level. And that's leading on to a huge rise in non-communicable diseases like diabetes, heart disease, etc., and with enormous implications down the road for public health and public finances. So we're beginning to look at food in its wider context. And that's the context, I think, that we see that the Food System Summit is important, and we see that Ireland has a particular opportunity to play a critical role there, and that's certainly helped by the fact that in our own domestic policy, in the 2030 Food System Strategy, we've attempted to frame our future on the basis of sustainable food systems.
Okay, and it's interesting, seeing as how you raised that point about Ireland's role there, I'd like to bring you in, Michelle, because I was struck in our keynote speakers. And, you know, while we have a ways to go, and Susanna was talking about our peer review, I was struck by what Jamie was saying about Ireland's leadership role. So from your point of view, given the work that you do, and I've another Slido poll question for you, so that's coming up in a second. But just if you tell us at this stage about the potential of that leadership role?
Thank you. I think I'll start by saying, you know, our international development policy, A Better World, places an emphasis on reaching what we call the furthest behind first. And I think that really focuses attention on food systems and indeed food security. It's important to bear in mind that effectively every single one of the Sustainable Development Goals relies on a sustainable food system. So if we don't crack this particular challenge now, we never will. There are only 9 harvests to 2030, as somebody pointed out in one of the previous dialogues. Ireland has been very consistent on the leadership around food and championing of food. But I think in addition to our experience and our intellectual leadership on this, we do have a moral leadership. I think the President mentioned at the weekend the sense of moral outrage around hunger that the majority of Irish people have. Most Irish people can speak to the experience of hunger on society, on our economy and so on. And I think that does give us a degree of legitimacy. And I think everybody recognises that we're not where we need to be at the moment. You know, we have this great opportunity this year, but the clock is really ticking. So really, you know, we have the policy framework, we have the experience, but importantly, we have that public support. And I think the government feels very strongly that we should be capitalising on that and mobilising that in this particular set of conversations that will happen this year.
And it's interesting that point you make about public support. Before we go any further, let me give you another Slido poll. What aspects of Ireland's agri-food experience could be of most interest and benefit to developing countries? Is it our grassland farming systems? Is it food safety and traceability? Is it approaches to farming cooperatives? Is it research and extension systems, or is it accessing international markets? And, you know, trade is such a huge part of all of this. It would be interesting to hear what you say on that. Owen, from your point of view, I mean, Devenish exporting to more than 50 countries, the role that private business plays here, what role can you make? What contribution can you make?
Thank you. The business, by definition, is focused primarily on delivering solutions. And we're all clear about the problems and the challenges. But as has been mentioned by previous speakers, the clock is ticking. And that focus has to very much become, how do we solve problems? And I would say, first and foremost, that's what business is good at doing, at scale, quickly, and probably most important of all, affordably.
And that's what you think. And also, I was wondering about when the priority being about, you know, so many people thinking it was important to help smallholders. What's the role of companies like yourselves? You know, this could come out of the summit as one of the, you know, the aims and another goal that we're all setting for ourselves. You say you're solutions focused. What kind of solutions might be possible in that area?
Well, one of the most important, and we find generally underestimated, is in the area of know-how. And there's a lovely expression about that says, everything is simple when you know how.
Yeah.
And of course, know-how is a huge issue. If you haven't had the opportunity from an educational point of view, if you don't have the resources to apply, know-how can be in short supply. So I think closing that know-how gap is first on my list. And in our own case, we engage with about 200,000 smallholder farmers in Kenya. And it is really instructive to see up close where those know-how gaps are, and also to see, encouragingly, the very great difference it can make very quickly when those gaps get closed. So one of the things that we're very focused on is the opportunity in all of this. There's a great deal to be done, but there's actually a great capability to deliver big solutions quickly. And I don't want to remotely claim that COVID could ever be a good thing, but it's the first time in my life I have seen a challenge at that level globally. And it's been hugely impressive to see how whole of society has mobilised to confront that challenge, and to be 1 year later looking at a situation where global scale solutions which are affordable are being delivered. It's extraordinary. And on that one, I would say the role of science probably has been the biggest standout for me We have huge amounts of really world-leading science being delivered day and daily. Perhaps pre-COVID, we didn't always have sufficient respect for what it was that science could accomplish, or maybe even more than respect, perhaps not always the sense of urgency around dealing with difficult issues. And I hope and expect one of the lessons to come out of COVID is going to be an increased focus on stepping into difficult problems before they come to bite us.
That's fascinating, and I'll come back to you to ask you more about Kenya. And interesting as well the way you talk about the pandemic, because obviously the issue with these marvellous vaccines that have been invented now and are being produced at scale and are affordable is of course the whole issue of equity of access, and the World Health Organization talking about that as well. And that's obviously, you know, very much part of the theme of what we're talking about today. Charlie, maybe you talk to me about your perspective on Ireland and the leadership role that we can play. Where are the gaps? What are we doing right, and where are the gaps?
Like, firstly, we're doing lots of things right. We're an agri-food nation. We have been for decades, and you know the leadership of IFIAD in terms of the focus on, you know, leaving no one behind, reaching the furthest behind, like a pro-poor, you know, focus on relation to our development activities. It certainly stands out on the international stage. And so if we look at sustainable food systems, I guess the challenge for us is to ask ourselves, do the claims of sustainability, do they stand up to scrutiny? Because if we don't scrutinize our sustainability claims, then others will. Then I suppose on one hand, we have to consider what's happening with our overseas partners. If we look at Africa, Africa will have 2.5 billion people. By 2050, about 1 in 10 of those will be in extreme poverty if things continue as they are, and that'll be 90% of the world's extreme poor. So the sustainable food systems, you know, that are needed to meet the needs of the extreme poor on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we have the health outcomes associated with obesity. These are somewhat, we're going to have to tailor these in different directions. There is no one size fits all. There's a lot of claims or efforts around, you know, making transformations of our food systems, but we have to realize that our food systems we're building from the ones that we have right now. So we can make incremental changes to the ones we have now, but there are calls for transformational changes, which may be much more difficult to achieve. And for transformational changes to occur, that may mean changing our farming systems, our consumption patterns, and these are difficult and they're also risky, and we do need dialogue between differing stakeholders who really may not be on the same map, let's say, in terms of where we want to get to. Even though everybody agrees where we want to get to, how to get there is contested. And within the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development, we've brought together differing stakeholder institutions, and we're working, you know, together to see, you know, where our differences are, where we have commonalities, and to see what can be done together. And I think we have to have such processes if we want to build consensus.
Okay, there's a lot that's in there, and I'll come back to you on some of those points. But I wanted to pick up on that point Charlie was making about Africa and population growth and the challenge. I mean, not just, you know, you've described the problems we've got already in terms of hunger and poverty, and, you know, where we were even before the pandemic and now worse. But add the projected population growth in Africa on top of that. I mean, it's not as if this isn't a daunting task, this summit in the autumn, is it?
Well, Africa is, in a sense, in the cockpit of these challenges going forward. Between now and 2050, world population is due to increase by about 2 billion, from just below 8 billion now to just below 10 billion in 30 years' time. 3/4 of that population increase will happen in Africa. That's a statistic that not generally known, but that is the case.
That's some number, isn't it?
It is a huge number, and it also just reflects the development challenges that Africa is faced with. There will be, over that same period, an additional 800 million people coming into the African workforce. That means Africa has to create, on average, 27 million new jobs per year. That's a staggering increase. And what that really means, has profound implications for the agri sector and the rural sector of Africa. And if Africa is to achieve the sort of development success that it needs to do in order to create those jobs, it's going to have to be based in the first instance on development of the agri-food and rural sector. And that's where I think Ireland has a real role to play, building on its tradition over the many years of working on a development basis with Africa. Now we're moving into a different space, and that's where the relevance of sustainable food systems come into play. Jamie was very interesting to say, to reflect on how when there was this meeting in two and a half, nearly 3 years ago now, with 11 African countries, and subsequently at a meeting in Rwanda in 2019, a very great interest on behalf of African countries in how Ireland had developed its own sector, its own economy, particularly its own agri-food system. And I think their interest was that they could see relevance in the Irish model. Yeah. It's not that Ireland was coming to Africa and saying, look, this is how to do it. Not at all. That's not where you start from. You start from a very honest examination of where you're starting from in Africa. As the great John Hume used to say about Irish politics, you start from where you are. But they also found that there were many aspects of the Irish experience which could be relevant to the African experience. And that's really the perspective that is needed to be.
So it's the point that Owen was making, because traditionally, people think in terms of, development and a lot of it, the origins was a lot of the interest here, would be in the charitable sector. Yeah. But now actually what Africa wants is know-how, the kind of know-how that's been developed in our agri-food sector here.
There's going to be a huge increase in African demand for food over the next 30 years because of population increase and income increase. Now, what Africa needs to do is make sure that Africa itself supplies a great part of that additional demand. And that's where the whole imperative to get more effective change at the level of the food systems in Africa has to take place. And it's about setting a policy framework which encourages that to happen. It's about dealing with short-term problems, and there are many short-term problems, but it's also about putting down the long-term basis for development. That's about institutions, etc. And it's that in those areas of policy and institutions that I think Ireland has a really important role to play.
It's interesting in the light of this, the results of that Slido poll, the aspects of Ireland's agri-food experience that could be of most interest and benefit to developing countries. The vast majority saying approaches to farming cooperatives could be of most interest and benefit to developing countries. Second place, research and extension systems. And Charlie, based on the experience that you have had in dialogue with African nations coming together, what do you make of those Slido poll results?
To me, they make sense. It's because, if we consider, firstly, our approach to working with other countries has to be a partnership-based approach, and every African country has every country basically has its national economic plan, agricultural plan, its national adaptation plan. So I guess we have to work in a manner in partnership with our country partners to ensure that we're working in tandem and in synergy with them and not at cross purposes. And in some sense, we have three kind of spheres of engagement. We have our overseas development assistance engagement, which may speak to reaching the furthest behind. And then we have our exports, which may speak to a different aspect of food security, if you may. And then we also have foreign direct investment, which may speak to the question of where the jobs going to be generated in rural areas in Africa, which it's quite difficult to generate jobs in rural areas in Ireland, so even more challenging in Africa. So I think there is a policy coherence question here where we really need to foster more dialogue across departments, and as Suzanne indicated, the intergenerational piece is important, but we also have to work with our partners to see if our activities are really in synergy with other nations that we consider to be in partnership with.
And that's interesting, isn't it, that point Susanna was making, Michelle, about policy coherence. Because again, you know, while there's a lot of support for Ireland's foreign aid policies and the work that has gone on, it's not necessarily, you know, translating that into making sure that what you're doing in trade, what you're doing in terms of investment, what you're doing in terms of, you know, the profits you're looking after for yourself in your own country, it means you've got to say, no, hang on, how are these all interlinked? And that's another level entirely. Again, do you think we're making that shift in the run-up to this autumn?
I think we're certainly making an effort in that direction. I mean, Susanna was right that one of the findings of the OECD DAC peer review was that this was something that we needed to address. We have worked hard, certainly, at engaging right across government on our international development objectives. A Better World is not a Department of Foreign Affairs policy, it's a government policy, and all of the various government departments have signed up to and were engaged in its development. So we have breathed new life into what we call the Interdepartmental Committee on International Development, and that is a forum really now where we thrash out some of these issues, where we know we have elements of incoherence and we really kind of work on that. I think also the point that Charlie makes about the knowledge that we're transferring and making sure it's appropriate, that's something I think we take very seriously as well. We are not necessarily trying to tell the world that you should do things the way we do them. I think we are honest.
Because the road to hell has been paved with good intentions in that regard, and there are lots of examples, aren't there, all over Africa?
Exactly,
yes.
and we recognise we have learning to do. I mean, these dialogues have demonstrated that we have learning to do. What I'm seeing is that a lot of the engagement we have, let's say, with African partners, is very much around how we do things, how we place the smallholder farmer at the centre of our work, how we work with cooperatives, how private sector, civil society, government come together. But we're learning from them too. You know, there are many, many areas of great policy innovation happening in Africa that we could do well to reflect on as we deepen our own understanding of food systems and address some of these thorny challenges, like Charlie mentioned, the problem of rural employment. We don't have all the answers, and I think that humility and a fluidity and an open conversation within government, and indeed with our civil society, research and so on partners, is at least a first step to addressing areas of policy incoherence anyway.
Owen, talk to me more about the know-how, the sharing of know-how. Talk to me about how that's been working.
Well, given current circumstances, perhaps a good place to start with, unsurprisingly, is the role of vaccines, in this case around animal production.
Yeah.
And the ability of innovation of that type to have a very rapid transformative effect on production in locations like Kenya, like Uganda, Ethiopia and others. So the innovation agenda, and if I could take it a little further, many of those innovations, once they become established, I think we've constantly to remind ourselves, get taken for granted in the locations in which they're applied. We very quickly forget what the problem looked like, and therefore it reduces our sense of how much could be accomplished if those technologies, that know-how, was made more universally applicable. And you mentioned that in your earlier comment about one of the challenges we're unsurprisingly currently facing is the issue of global equity. But as against that challenge, hasn't COVID brought home, in a way certainly I've never seen before, how globally connected we all are, and that actually a problem for one is either directly a problem for all or has the potential to so become, and very rapidly. So I think self-interest is also important to call out. It is in everybody's self-interest. Doesn't matter what sector, what geography, what station of life, there is just a huge self-interest in focusing on and delivering with a sense of urgency solutions to these problems, because somebody else's problem today can very, very quickly become our problem tomorrow.
Yeah. And it's actually gas, isn't it? At the moment, you know, there's a shortage of Cadbury's flakes in Ireland. They're produced in Egypt. You know, again, there are all these kinds of... We're suddenly much more aware of supply lines. We're suddenly much more aware of, you know, something we think was produced down the road. It's not actually produced down the road anymore. Charlie, I'd like to bring you in on this, because I was interested actually in Susanna's reference to citizens' assemblies. Because I know, and we've been getting this theme in, you know, it's all about, you know, helping the small farmers and rural communities and all of that. But what was key when we were having the discussion about rural communities here in Ireland and trying to, if you like, get through the, you know, change and more sustainable change there, what was key was the way the people communicate with people. What was key was getting local buy-in from the ground up. So things like citizens' assemblies, things like local education and discussion and networks, how important are all of they, and what experience do you think we could bring to the table?
Yeah, these are all really critical, like the innovations that are necessary for these transformations of our food systems are not only technical, they're also social, and so social innovations. And with social innovation, like if we consider innovators exist everywhere in society. It's not just those in universities. If you're poor, there are poor people who are innovators. In fact, arguably it could be considered that you need to be more of an innovator to live in a poverty situation. And so for that reason, we really do need, like, it's interesting that the audience point towards the role of cooperatives, empowerment, and social capital building exercises that enable representation of people and people to chart their own destiny. And in that sense, you know, we should be careful about, you know, exporting our own, you know, our best intended sort of views of what we think should be solutions for others, when in fact they may know what the solutions are themselves, and in fact just need assistance in identifying them and mobilizing the resources to achieve them.
We've had a question in from our audience, Tom. Ireland shouldn't use environmentally unsustainable intensive systems to grow food for export. This is globally unsustainable. I suppose that's, you know, this is part of the question about, you know, how much are we living up to the very noble aims that we're setting ourselves in our development policy when, for instance, we look at the way we're producing food ourselves.
Yeah. Nobody should claim that we're perfect. At the moment, we're not. There needs to be more progress made on the way in which we environmentally produce food. That's at the heart of the 2030 strategy. But equally, at the heart of the 2030 strategy is the fact that there needs indeed to be a balance between environmental, economic, and social sustainability. So I think that's the challenge we face. But I think in broad terms, I mean, Ireland is not, if it's attempting to talk to other countries about sustainable food production, it's going to actually firstly listen to them as to where they're starting from and what they want to achieve. What they will want to achieve by and large is a capacity to increase their food production, to satisfy their own needs in the first instance, and in the second instance to maybe satisfy on a regional basis Africa's needs. It's only really at a third and later stage they should be looking at international markets. But there has to be, I think, a really serious partnership based on mutual respect, based on sound planning, between Africa does need assistance in this regard. And I mean, the likes of Owen's company, Devenish, are just one example of how that assistance can also take place. I mean, the whole
I
role
love
of
that idea of sharing know-how.
Absolutely. The private sector, and most African countries fully accept this at this stage. The private sector has an important role to play in their future development.
Yes, and in fact, a lot of the really brilliant development work that has happened in Africa in terms of the empowerment of women has been about giving them the means to earn money for themselves and earn money for their families, which has been fantastic.
I mean, putting women and smallholder farming at the centre of strategy in most African countries is absolutely the right way to go.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I'm allowed. I'm not usually allowed to express an opinion, but I'll express that one. But as well, you know, I mean, these are tough challenges. There's no doubt about that, Michelle. You know, it'd be easy to sit around and just, you know, say lots of noble things, but actually delivering on this is not going to be easy. And as you say, only 9 harvests to 2030. And within that, we've already spoken about the pandemic. But again, I was really struck when Rory spoke about the locusts, because again, that's a consequence of, you know, global warming, of rainfall in the desert. So you're getting these, you know, locust populations and at a size and we've never seen before and so on. And the impact they have had didn't get as much attention probably as it deserved. But this is the reality of the world we live in now. So besides trying to climb that mountain, we're also going to be having to take, you know, avalanches raining down on top of us.
Yeah. I think I totally agree. You know, I'd like to bring us back to hunger for a moment. I mean, hunger doesn't happen as a result of a neat sequence of events. It's often a series of really complex interrelated events that happen. And the one thing that is consistent actually in extreme hunger crises in the world at the moment is conflict. So I was really surprised that so few people thought that addressing conflict and peace building was a game-changing solution. In fact, we are quite focused on that and on that relationship between conflict and hunger. So conflict doesn't necessarily create hunger, but what it can do is exacerbate climate vulnerability, you know, weakness due to, let's say, a death in the family or indeed a collapse in markets or something. So we're really looking for ways to try to address that. As you probably know, we're on the UN Security Council at the moment, and really taking that opportunity to call that out and signal where we see an injustice based on conflict. And in fact, when the Food Systems Summit happens in September, we will hold the presidency of the UN Security Council.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that, right.
Yeah, so we'll be really focusing efforts. We've been working really closely with Niger on the monitoring of what we call Security Council Resolution 2417, which really just looks at that dynamic and what we can do. Peace building is also really important. Ireland has an unbroken record of peacekeeping troops at the UN for 60 years. And again, that's an area where we do have a degree of moral authority. So we'll really be trying to force the issue there, but recognising again that it's not as simple as, you know, a ceasefire and then hunger goes away. You know, we know there are lots of interlocking factors.
But again, you know, our defence forces and the experience they've gained in that peacekeeping, that's a real example of the know-how that's been able to be translated and shared in so many situations. Oh, and one of our Slido questions is saying one proposed game-changing solution for the Food Systems Summit is the End Hunger Fund. And our questioner says the concept is that private business would donate $5 billion to this targeted fund. I'm not asking you to come up with the $5 billion now, but what's your comment on that? And you know, the role of the private sector in coming up with a sum that big?
The private sector is doing, in that regard, a lot more than is generally realised. And one of the terms that's applied to this is the concept of philanthropic giving. So I think it's useful to consider just how much has changed in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of the initiatives being taken by sometimes very prominent people to apply what for me are mind-bending sums of money on global problems. And when we stop to reflect, we'll all be able to call out prominent examples of that. One of the effects that's having is demonstrating what can be done. And the trend in that area is sharply up. And a further thing that's happening is that this is all being formalized for business as for society in the legal and financial frameworks around what's described as the ESG governance agenda, environmental, social and governance. And one of the things that, again, back to COVID, that I found very motivating was the sense that many people had been concerned that COVID would derail the ESG agenda. The finding, in fact, is that COVID has accelerated the ESG agenda and actually has extended the ESG agenda for many people, for whom it's now become an ESG H agenda, the H being a focus on human health. So I think sometimes it's...
And why do you think that is? Simply the fact of the pandemic has reminded us all of our interdependence?
But also how it brought to light things of which we were already aware, but perhaps had not connected. Tom made reference, for example, and other speakers have made reference to the challenge of obesity. And suddenly we discover that people who are obese have far worse outcomes in a COVID challenge. People who are vitamin D deficient, people who are omega-3 deficient. And you can sum all of that up by saying it brings under a spotlight something which we've been aware of at a high level for a long time, how important good quality food, a role it can play in promoting good health and preventing ill health. So I think we've now crossed a Rubicon which says we cannot continue down a path of simply treating people when they become sick. We've got to put far more focus on preventing people getting into that position. And with that focus, a consideration of just how much potential there is in that and the role of food in delivering that.
And even where people do fall, you know, I mean, illness may be inevitable, but the healthier you are, the better you're going to cope. Charlie, there's a question that's come in, and maybe in answering it, you'd also talk to us about the work you've been doing with the National Task Team on Rural Africa. And the question is, how can we ensure that global food system dialogues include the voices of smallholders and experts in agricultural sectors from across Africa? Is that happening? Is it not happening enough? How do we make more happen?
It is happening, but like there's lots of activity happening, you know, in this space in Ireland and internationally. That the NTTRA process, the National Task Team for Rural Africa process, was a really valuable process, which helped us really to map out. It was led by Tom and others, and it helped us to map out what are the activities in Ireland, both on the university sector, Teagasc, the companies. Trade with our African partners to get a snapshot of what that is, and there's a lot of disparate activities, and the recommendations of the NTTRA, there's a range of recommendations about better advisory services, supports to businesses who want to engage with African partners, both for trade reasons but also for development outcome reasons, and also for a more Ireland Inc. approach, I suppose, to our engagement with our African partners. There are lots of forums, both within the United Nations systems, we work a lot with the CGIAR system as an example. It's a research system globally, and within the European Union. The European Union, just this week, Ursula von der Leyen has indicated that, you know, the greening back better for the African subcontinent and for the African Union is an area of interaction between the European Union and Africa. So there's lots of opportunities for voice, but I think that Irish Aid plays a particular role in giving voice to those that don't have voice and supporting organizations to get them to the table, whether that's in the climate change negotiations, which in COP26 coming up at the end of this year, or any other types of fora where we can, and there's possible to get the voices of those who don't have usually a voice at the table. So I think we are doing a pretty good job in that respect.
And as a final comment then, Tom, you spend a lot of time in committee rooms these days, you know, trying to pull all these threads together. And you've also spent so much of your life on the ground in Africa. So that challenge of turning, you know, bringing the consensus together and also turning all these fine words into changes that actually make a difference on the ground in the place you care about so much. Do you think, well, you wouldn't think it's hopeless, you wouldn't be doing it otherwise, but how confident are you we can make a difference?
Well, what I am clear about is that this year and the Food System Summit represents a huge opportunity to at least go in the right direction and try and get commitments to achieve things. At the end of the day, it's going to come down, in Africa's case, to the efforts of Africa's own governments and citizens, how well this will succeed. I'm very glad in the next panel you'll have Usman, who you will find is a person of great authority, and he will, I think, be able to answer that question better than I am. But it is the moment is that we have to take this opportunity of this year to see, can we chart the future and commit people to making sure that future is better than the present.
Okay, and I look forward to talking to you again, Tom, in the next couple of months as we move along the way. Tom, Michelle, Owen, Charlie, thank you all. It's been my pleasure to talk to you for this panel. I wish I could stay talking to you for longer, but we've a lot more to do.